What does a more equitable future look like? What role does journalism play? And what type of information can better inform and represent our local communities? With these questions in mind, Presente Media followed 3 Philadelphia residents: Alma Romero, a health promoter at Puentes de Salud; Mai Lee, a youth organizer at Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project; and Jalil King, a Philadelphia photographer. Our hope is that by following their personal journeys while they navigate some of the challenges that our city is facing, local journalists will be able to better address these communities' information needs.
Hey everybody, welcome to Beyond, Reimagining Philadelphia Journalism. We are so happy to have you here. I'm Cheryl Thompson-Morton, Program Manager at the Lumpfest Institute and one of the co-creators of Beyond. Now, I'd be remiss if I were to start this event without honoring the original inhabitants of this land. Philadelphia sits within the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape tribe. We stand on their shoulders today. So, what is Beyond, and what is it that we're doing here? This event is a 3-day interactive that aims to start to build the framework for a future of Philadelphia media where all communities are being served the information they need to make the choices for their lives. Over the course of the next 3 days, you'll hear from journalists, managers, news executives, and community members in the Philadelphia area on issues of equity in journalism. This event was designed in partnership with journalists of color here in the ecosystem to help discover what is the best purpose for this event and also what is the best design to achieve our ends. Please join me in thanking them for their contributions to this event. We have several aspirations for this event. They include, first, building a common language around diversity, equity, and inclusion. This will be done throughout the conference, but especially through the Roots of Social Justice section led by Dr. Shakti. That will be hosted November 18th at 2 p.m. Second, creating a better understanding of community information needs and how journalism can address them. The highlight of this is going to be a presentation of the documentary we commissioned from Presente Media, asking 3 Philadelphians how journalism can be of service to them in their communities. You just saw the preview to it, and it really is worth watching with us. That event will be November 18th at 11 a.m. The third is to ideate on a collective vision on a future of Philadelphia journalism. This will mainly take place during our Radical Imagination session, November 19th at 2:30 p.m. And then finally, we want to support greater transparency around how newsrooms are addressing equity in their newsrooms and coverage. That's going to take place on November 19th at noon. We hope to see you at all of these events. Now, to help support this work, there are a few principles that we ask that everyone agrees to use during this time. The first is about respect. So we respect the autonomy of people to choose when to grow and change. And although we hope this event is a catalyst, the choice is ultimately yours. Second, that this is a brave space. So in this space, we're amplifying voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. And sometimes when we're having these conversations, it gets a little tough, it gets a little messy, but it's our place to learn together. So work through the mess, work through the tough conversations. The third is to allow for vulnerability. So really feel free to share thoughts that aren't fully fleshed out, because the joy of this event is that we have a community of practice that can help us grow our ideas and grow and learn together. And then finally, put the common good first. Also, while we're on kind of the topics of these overarching themes, I just want to remind you for Hopin, the platform, this platform works best in Chrome or Firefox. So if you're using another browser, you'll want to switch over now because when it's time to go into breakout rooms, you're going to have a tough go. Also, just FYI, to keep checking your chat and the polls throughout your time with us so you can see when new polls or chats emerge. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't note some of the work that has happened in prior and concurrent generations that makes the work we're doing today possible. We stand on the shoulders of enslaved Africans brought to this country, who built this country to be the wealthiest in the world while being barred from participation in the wealth accumulation. We stand on the shoulders of the resistance movements of various colonized folks who aim to throw off the chains of oppression and show us a more liberatory future. We stand on the shoulders of women, LGBT, and disability rights advocates that have pushed for our society to stand up to the ideals of liberty and justice for all. We stand on the work of the Chicago Commission, the Kerner Commission, and the Community Relations Service, who spoke of the ways that media perpetuates harm on Black communities and produced solutions over the course of the last century. We stand on the shoulders of the Black journalists in this city who built the founding association of Black journalists. We stand on the shoulders of Carla Murphy, the Maynard Institute, and the Media 2070 Project that push us to examine the deep inequities of journalism and how to dismantle them. We stand on the shoulders of the journalists of color who designed this event. And we do this work in this moment to enable the next generation to stand on our shoulders. I know that many people didn't join today because of the general malaise of these type of events. I understand and respect that sentiment and respect where everyone is on their journey. But I am so grateful for each of you being here because the work we do over the next few days will be the building blocks for the future. So with that, I thank you, and I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Jim Friedlich, who is going to introduce our keynote speaker. See you all soon.
Good morning. Thank you very, very much to Cheryl Thompson Morton for leading this event this morning and for much, much more. I'm Jim Friedlich with the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. I'm very pleased to tell you that we have almost 200 people joining the summit, from community members to a highly diverse group of journalists to a very broad and senior group of executives and senior editors, a truly outstanding group from around the country and around Philadelphia. Everyone here has at least one thing in common. We're all of us, seeking meaningful change in Philadelphia and American journalism. It's my honor this morning to introduce an inspirational agent of change. Dr. Shakti Butler is a filmmaker, a speaker, and a trainer focused on social justice and racial equity. Dr. Shakti will begin this morning with a keynote conversation about how we might imagine and build a better future for Philadelphia journalism, a future that's healthier, more connected, more equitable, and more sustainable. After Dr. Shakti's opening talk, we'll break into small groups. We'll begin together to design and build a future for a better Philadelphia journalism ecosystem. Some very quick reminders, some housekeeping. First, when you tweet about this event, and we hope you do, please use the hashtag #BeyondPhilly. You can also find all of the Twitter handles for each speaker throughout the 3 days, every panelist, every keynote speaker. If you follow Lenfest Institute, that's at Lenfest, INST. Second, as Cheryl said earlier, please use Chrome or Firefox. Please use a laptop or a desktop rather than a phone to really enjoy this event and be able to participate in the breakouts. Third, this morning's session lasts till 12:30. This afternoon, we have a truly stunning and powerful group of journalists of color, individuals who are leading the struggle for change in American newsrooms. This afternoon's session starts at 2:30. I hope you'll join us then and throughout the 3 days. It's now my great honor, my pleasure, to introduce Dr. Shakti Butler. Shakti?
Good morning. Thank you, Jim. That was wonderful. Nice to have an overview of all the hard work that has gone into and all of the aspirations for what journalism can become. So good morning to everyone who's in the audience. And I have a quick question for you. Are you breathing? I thought so. We're going to begin with what is called a conocimiento. Conocimiento comes from the farm workers movement, and it's all about how does change actually happen? How does movement happen? And one of the things that's really critical that they discovered, and many people have discovered as well, is that we have to understand what our collective strengths actually are. When things get hard, it's our strengths that we lead into. And so just take a moment to look at the screen and imagine that you are either outside and it's beautiful outside and the trees are there and the leaves are moving, or you can imagine that you're any place that you'd like to be where you feel at ease. I'm going to invite you to just notice your breath. When you breathe, what are you aware of inside your body? Is your in-breath or out-breath cooler or warmer than one another? Is your in-breath or out-breath, one part of it shorter, colder? Just paying attention to your own body. I'm going to invite us to take 3 deep breaths together. When you take a deep breath, you exhale first. Breathe in deeply. Hold it for a moment, and then just relax. Now please take 3 deep breaths at your own pace. And if you're willing, you can close your eyes. Now notice your body again. I feel like at this point, I can say welcome. That we are grounded, we are present, and grateful for the fact that we are breathing. That is a good thing. Next slide, please. I'm going to ask you right now to take a few moments to remember the circumstances that led you to choose the field of media, or perhaps it chose you. But what inspired you? What moved you towards becoming a person who is working in the field of media? And now ask yourself, what is an intention or a skill or a talent that you offer to others that is a gift to yourself and to the field? Perhaps it's your courage or your patience or your fill in the blank. Now, with this one example of your own greatness, take a moment to write it down. That one word, just a small example of your own greatness. And now I'd invite you to remember a time when you were actually being that value, that gift, that special part of who you are, that when you offer it to yourself and you offer it to others, it lifts people up. Being aware of our strengths. Quite an indigenous way of being. And if you're willing, if you would write some of your gifts in the chat while you're also imagining yourself being your gift. How do you put it into action? So I'm asking you to do 2 things. Be aware of an example of your own greatness and write it in the chat when you're ready, but also remember a time when you were being that example And how do you do that? How do you put it into action? So thank you. If you would write them in the chat, I'd love to see a whole flood of the qualities, the strength that are present at this event. And while you do that, I'm going to move to the next slide. The way that I work is that I look at what it means to be in deep relationship with ourselves, relationship with others, relationship with the earth. And this title, As Above, So Below, speaks to that connection. It's a relational way of thinking and being. And our time together this morning is an invitation to engage, to play with our wildest dreams, your ideas about possibility. I'm talking about the potential of humanity's greatness. It's about being on a journey geared towards the highest good for all. So I'm going to ask, I don't see any comments in the chat, but I'm going to wait until I have some comments about the greatness that's here with us. Yes. So here are some of the things that you've written. Quite a few. I was in the wrong chat box, so I didn't see them at first. I thought nobody was responding, but I'm glad that you have. We understand that we have flexibility as a quality here, empathy, the gift of offering grace and receiving grace, vision, optimism, curiosity, good listening, welcoming, suspending ego to speak for someone else in their true voice, advocacy. Someone else's superpower is to raise meaningful money and resources for powerful change in journalism. Compassion, passion, encouraging others, creativity, resilience, empathy, and so many. You can scroll down and see them. Imagine this as a bouquet. That might be a little bit corny, but I actually like it. It's these gifts that you offer freely to others are markers in many ways. They're markers for you to recognize when you're standing in that state of being good and flexible and filled with love, all of those things. But they also mark when you move out of that state. So if I were to share with you that love is a gift that I think I offer freely, I could talk to you about that and how I do that, how I listen, how I'm present, what that means. But if you cut me off on the freeway at 7 o'clock in the morning, you probably won't see that love. And so we have this way that we can really begin to take into account how we show up and what we bring. And what's wonderful to notice is that all these strengths that have been listed, they are not in competition with one another. We need them all. And so take a moment to thank yourself, to congratulate yourself for being aware of the goodness that you bring. Next slide, please. So Cheryl already shared with us some of the guidelines for today. And so I'm not going to talk to you at great length about this at all. But we are being asked for you to speak your truth and to do that with respect and to listen for understanding. And you've been asked to lean into what might become uncomfortable. But also we want to embrace paradox, that more than one thing can be true at a time, and that we're not limited to just binary thinking of good and bad and right and wrong. Allow yourself to play with the ideas that come up for you, that you can continue beyond this time that we have together, of course. And we won't finish anything, but I am asking you to seek intentional learning from one another. And so I thank you for being here. And if there are any other things that you bring, you hold them inside and you offer them to the group. I'd like to share with you a story. This is a story that took place on Juneteenth, which was June 19th of 2020. And it's important to notice the parameters of the story that we're hearing. So on Juneteenth, my friend, Ruth King, who is a wonderful insight meditation teacher, she's a life coach and author, she wrote about a scene that she witnessed while watching television on Juneteenth. She was watching one of the many global protest rallies that was catalyzed by the murder of George Floyd. The context, of course, is the lynching by knee of defenseless George Floyd and the image of him at the mercy of a white police officer. And you have to admit, and I know that many of you are doing so loudly, that there's something about a white officer lynching, having his knee on someone's neck, a defenseless Black man who is using his last breath to call his mama. This rips at the soul of Black people and all people who care about what it means to be human. And it reveals the soullessness of this nation in many ways. This public killing so normalized that the chasing down and killing of an innocent and defenseless man while jogging is also an example of the many, many, many that we could, pull upon or talk about. So Ruth is sharing that while she was watching the video clip of the protesters, something happened that cracked her wide open. And it was a scene that she could have easily missed had she chosen to do something like brush her teeth. But several bystanders took videos which were widely circulated and broadcast all over the world. And this is what Ruth wrote. On a recent still night, as I watched global protests on TV against the killing of Black people, my heart caught a scene that profoundly crushed me. A Black man, maybe 24, the age of my grandson, short, round body, dreadlocks, right hand gripping a baseball bat, walking increasingly with intensity toward the window of a retail store. The most unexpected and amazing thing happened. Black protesters surrounded him, affirming him with hopeful chants and encouraging him to join them in a peaceful protest. It took a few moments, but then he surrendered to their care. And I sensed that perhaps his deeper wish had been met in that moment, to be seen, to have the weight of his rage shared, and to be cared for. So this story captures the reflections of a collective journey. We can recognize parts of ourselves in this young man. It's about how we can all feel insanely enraged and weary and longing sometimes to call our mama. This is a part of revolution that combines love with power. It's a story about the value of rage and how it can be channeled to drive change. And who would have guessed that one of the byproducts of COVID would be to forge a deeper pathway to racial justice? This story, deeper longing that many people have. I know that it touched me. And it is about the importance of being reassured and surrounded by loving care. This is the healing meaning of Juneteenth in this story. And if this story touches you, and obviously you know why, this is what the human legacy that we wish to leave to our generations to come contains this ability for us to be connected and taking care of one another. Next slide, please. To assume that our current racial dysfunction is disconnected from America's continental and Eurocentric past is a delusion of the highest order. Our racial past echoes through the air we breathe and permeates the ground on which we walk. This fragment of consciousness predates our birth, but still flows through our neural networks and the veins of our being. This was written by Larry Ward, as you can see. We cannot understand this country we live in without knowing the history of economic power and its abuse. This formation of whiteness is part of the story. If we don't have perceptions informed by multiple perspectives, then our analysis is shaky and our ability to address what must be changed is primarily governed through a Western epistemology that has embraced supremacy. So I'd like to draw the thread through how deeply history impacts us to this day. The patterns and relationships that are part of any system are so strong. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the history of the formation of whiteness, I want to share with you this little history about Bacon's Rebellion, which took place in Virginia in 1676. It was a catalyst for the steady progression of laws and policies that controlled Black folks, made them less than human, stripped of dignity, due process of law, and basic rights. The story is about Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy white property owner and relative of Virginia's governor, William Berkeley. But Bacon and Berkeley did not like each other, and they disagreed over issues pertaining to how the colony should be governed, including the colony's policy towards Native Americans. Bacon wanted the colony to retaliate for Native American raids on frontier settlements. He wanted to remove all Native Americans from the colony so landowners like himself could expand their property. This kind of reminds me of a recent headline that said buildings matter too. I think it was published by the Inquirer in a column, and it was about looting and vandalism on the margins of protests of George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. In any event, Berkeley feared that retaliation would unite all of the nearby tribes in a costly and destructive war, and this war would be organized against the colony. But in defiance of the governor, Bacon organized his own militia, consisting of white and Black indentured servants and enslaved people who joined in exchange for freedom, and they attacked nearby tribes. A power struggle ensued with Bacon, and his militia was on one side, and Berkeley, the Virginia House of Burgesses, and the rest of the colony's elite on the other. Months of conflict followed, including armed skirmishes between militias. And in September of 1676, Bacon's militia captured Jamestown and burned it to the ground. Virginia's wealthy planters were shaken by the fact that a rebel militia that united white and Black servants and slaves had destroyed the colonial capital. Legal scholar Michelle Alexander writes, "The events in Jamestown were alarming to the planter elite who were deeply fearful of the multiracial alliance of indentured servants and slaves. Word of Bacon's rebellion spread far and wide, and several more uprisings of a similar type followed. So in an effort to protect their superior status and economic position, the planters shifted their strategy for maintaining dominance. They abandoned their heavy reliance on indentured servants in favor of the importation of more Black slaves." After Bacon's rebellion, this is when Virginia lawmakers began to make legal distinctions between white and Black inhabitants. Soon after Bacon's rebellion, they increasingly distinguish between people of African descent and people of European descent. They enact laws which say that people of African descent are hereditary slaves, and they increasingly give power to independent white farmers and landholders. Now, here's what's interesting about this, that we normally say that slavery, enslavement, and freedom are opposite things. But what's really clear about Bacon's Rebellion is that freedom and slavery are diametrically connected. In actuality, we could say that white people were sold a bill of goods. With few exceptions, working whites would never be part of the elites, but they have privileges. According to the writer Theodore Allen, America's ruling classes created the category of the white race as a means of social control. Since the early invention, white privileges have enforced the myth of racial superiority, and that fact has been central to maintaining ruling class domination over ordinary working people of all colors throughout American history. According to the New York Times, and I've seen different statistics here, but I'll read the one that I have, 63% of white men voted for Trump. When you add education as a proxy for class to the statistic about white men, we see that 71 white men with no college degree voted for Trump, and 55% of white women voted for Trump. According to Charles Blow, one of my favorite journalists who writes for the New York Times, what he said was that these statistics make white people the only racial group in which a majority voted for Trump. I recently read an article called Resentment and Revenge, which is part of an anthology that's published by the Haas Institute out of UC Berkeley, California. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm connecting the dots between the past and the present. And I've collapsed much of what was said in order to be able to share it with you. Arlie Hochschild, a well-known sociologist, wrote a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, which describes how a politics of resentment and revenge can become a mobilizing force among working class white men, white women, and particularly those who are clinging to middle class, as well as those who live in harsh poverty. So why do downwardly mobile older white men and women lurch to the right? In order to actually understand why this happens, how they live in a colonial state, and that they are losers in an era of financialized capital, and the nature of their loss is something more than economic, it's status. We need to avoid making the mistake of thinking that we can separate class interests from other interests. Tea partiers in particular resist the state because they feel left behind. The cultural rationale is that they have done the right things all of their lives. That is, that they've worked hard, they've been good neighbors, and gone to church. And because it feels to them that the state is not on their side, they have turned against the state. A more accurate analysis, however, might be that there's an awareness that the enemy is capitalism and not the state. Philosopher Nancy Fraser's description of two sorts of recent political struggles in the United States, struggles over redistribution and recognition, provides a useful way to think about the politics. Redistribution is about material inequality, whereas recognition refers to the symbolic injustice such as cultural domination, lack of recognition, and disrespect in marginalized groups. Although Fraser analytically separates these struggles in people's lives and practices, these things are always intertwined. Relationships. In a book, Landscape for a Good Woman, historian Carolyn Steadman writes eloquently of her British working class mother's rage at the world in which she could not afford a particular type of skirt that was popular in her time. Steedman's account of her mother makes clear that economic injustices are experienced in a deeply embodied way, in the body, and that her mother experienced a particular form of gendered shame when social workers came to their house, and thus, for her mother, the injuries of class were therefore never just about class. Neither middle-class feminists nor Marxists were able to address the desires of working-class women who, and this woman was the breadwinner of her family, and she also had to be on the dole. Her mother became a working-class conservative whose primary politics was the politics of envy. I wish I had what, which becomes the politics of resentment. Why should they have what they have and I don't? Now, this is not for any particular group of people at this point. This is something that many people experience. It's called desire and jealousy. But it is an example of a particular political discourse that needs to be addressed. Groups such as Black Lives Matter do combine the politics of recognition and distribution, which had not until very recently resonated with a wide audience. The events of the spring of 2020, post the death of George Floyd, indicates that this is beginning to change. And we know that great leaders who can bring people across issues, bring them together to resist and change injustice, are often seen as threats and removed one way or another. This is also related to the role of consciousness and healing. What is the human legacy we wish to leave for generations to come? Can there be the daring invention of a new humanity within and beyond race? Can we heal and transform the patterns of continuation in our internalized, racialized practices and patterns? A fresher and deeper understanding of who we are, who we can become, requires an understanding beyond information gathering and also beyond just looking for the right answers. It requires a journey of lived experiences. It requires a gathering of wisdom. And for many, it's also a spiritual matter, not to be confused with religious belief. It is an embodiment of the profound. This possibility of healing is also necessary for transformation. It includes body-centered practices and training that can heal the axis of a wheel that just keeps turning out the same inequities and pain generation after generation. So I ask the question, how might we heal ourselves at deeper levels of consciousness? This is the invitation of the moment. So my interest is in radical imagination. And can we go to the next 2 slides? Sorry, I forgot to tell you to change. And you're going to slide 8, which is imagining change, which is about radical imagination. My interest in radical change making, and I use the term radical, which is defined by Angela Davis as grasping things by the root. This implies a need to explore and understand relationships, the connections that exist inside us, among us, and includes the natural world. So we know that change is possible, but the work is difficult for many reasons, the least of which is that it demands that we look inward and outward, both individually and collectively, internally and externally. We must see proverbial historical dots that connect the past to the current day, that challenge, and without interruption, they will blemish the future. We must learn and understand the political, economic, structural, physical, and emotional roots that have produced trauma. We have to talk about them and make them visible, particularly when they are so invisible often, and impacting this country, which is still running on the spoil and the tracks of the hundreds of years that led to the civil war that we are still fighting. And in addition to the need for structural change that produces more equitable access and outcomes, there's a deep need for re-education, restorative healing, and restorative justice. So what does education, connecting history to current day challenges, and the roots of why we find ourselves in a country that is still running on the spoils and the tracks of what has come before? Next slide, please. I was very lucky to have an amazing many things, one of the wisest people that I know. And he would say to me, everything that is was once a dream. Now I could tell you a lot about my dad, but I don't have time to say this. As the son of a Black man who lived in Texas, yes, my grandfather was enslaved in Texas. My father was born in 1890. I tell you this, he grew up in Barbados, Black father, Arawak Indian mother. Tremendous amount of wisdom, wisdom, way more than just knowledge. And when he would say to me, that is was once a dream, he was telling me, never forget dream big, go beyond what you see. It's like planting a seed in the ground. You plant a seed in the ground, but you can't dig it up every day to see how it's doing. You have to plant it and protect it. These seeds, these ideas of a future that can be are very, very important to us. Next slide, please. Oh, yes. Good. Thank you. We're perfect where we are. Go back. Go back to the previous slide. Thank you. So, given the complex challenges and multiple perceptions that we have in the world today, radical imagination is very important. And you can see that there are two questions on the screen. You may want to write them down. Today, we're going to be dealing with question 1. On Thursday, we'll be dealing with question 2. So question 1, what within the roles of journalism do you think, feel, might need to shift and or change? What if some of the ways that journalism functions needs changing? What needs to be presented more often? What needs to be analyzed in different ways? What needs to include more understanding of whole body learning? And what does it mean for us to really get underneath the stories that we hear so often that are really tied to history, and without that understanding of what it means to relate to that and make the changes that are needed? So in a moment, next slide, please. You're going to be going into classrooms, and in the chat box, you will see the instructions, but I'm just going to run through them. So once you find yourself in the breakout rooms, I'm going to ask you, well, I'm asking you now, if you would establish 3 roles. One person who is a facilitator, and what I mean by that is someone who will be sure that the conversation keeps moving, don't have lots of time. Someone who will be the timekeeper, and the times will be in the chat box of how long you have to do everything. And one person who will be the note taker or the reporter. Once you are in the breakout rooms, please say your first names, and please self-select the prescribed roles that I've just put forth. Bullet point some of your immediate ideas about what you think needs to change in journalism. And the way that you can do this is by polling. So you want to be sure that everybody has a chance to speak. And what will happen is when you get into the room, take a few moments to journal or write down a few notes. But then after 2 minutes, the person who is the facilitator will suggest that you share your names, and then you go around each person after you share your name, one idea that the note taker is going to write down. So kind of bullet point ideas, if you were, and then you can keep going around until you have exhausted the ideas that you have. Are you ready? All of the time logistics will be in the chat box for you as well. You'll be placed into groups of 4. And don't forget to select the roles that I have asked you to take on. So we'll see you in a little while.
Hey, everybody. Sorry about that. As you all know, when we plan these events, we lay the best of plans, but sometimes things go awry. So thank you for bearing with us during that time. We promise next time the breakout rooms will work, but we're going to engage in the experience together with the collective. So I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Shakti, who will guide us through this part of the conversation via our stage chat. Thanks again.
Thank you, Cheryl. Cheryl, as you said, the best laid plans, but I know y'all got to enjoy the music, right? The music was fantastic. So great playlist. I said playlist, that's interesting, but yes. If you can move us to the next slide, please, which is an image of time travel. So what we're going to do now is I want to just share with you that the whole idea of radical imagination, or at least the gist of it is that you time travel into the future. You time travel into the future, you lay your stake in the ground about the kinds of things that you are aspiring to create, the vision, as it were. And once you have established what the vision is, I'm going to say just 2 more things about it, and then I'm going to invite us to share in the chat box. The sharing of a vision allows you to be able to then notice what you need to do to get there. What are the barriers that would keep you from obtaining what you want to obtain, so you know where to direct your energies in some way, and also do a more thorough analysis of what it's going to require of you to make that change. But analysis, I'm not just talking about working from the prefrontal cortex. I'm talking about a whole body approach to being able to create what you want the world to be as you pay attention to the structures and the policies and changes that need to be made there, the healing that needs to be done, and also what it means to engage in creating this new vision. So thank you very much. If you had some ideas of things that you believe need to be changed, would you please start putting them in the chat box, and we can bring them up and see if there's some sense that you get of how things would be organized together. I'll explain that more once I see what some of your answers are. So go ahead and put in the chat box some of the things that you would like to have be a part of steady practice of journalism, and how it can help create a future that is spectacular. So Maddie, can you help me so I'm sure that I'm in the right place so I can see what people are saying? Some people like the music, I can see now, and some people didn't hear the music. Okay, so we're starting to get in some ideas. More access to journalism jobs and jobs in general without having a college education. So taking that as an example, we could say we could take that idea and organize it around what does it mean to address poverty, the ability to make a living, the ideas that people have about what is a valuable contribution that someone can make, i.e. the value of community members who understand their lives better than the people who sometimes end up telling them what they should do. So in a room together, which would be my preference, of course, and you were working in groups of 4 or 5, we would be scrolling on big sheets of paper what these ideas are. We're talking about a requirement for diversity at higher levels in newsrooms among decision makers, not only among journalists, but the sources as well. And I think that is so important. It's like, where do you go to get the information that you need that's going to deepen the understanding or invite the people who are readers or purveyors of the information to be able to ask themselves new questions? Not just stories about communities, but understanding from the people who live in those communities and shift the balance away from being first, when being compassionate and accurate sit in the balance. I wish that we could hear you, Denise, because I would love to hear what you have to say about that a little bit more deeply. Set up pathways for feedback for editors, especially to actually trust what they hear from people of color. I'm so glad that this is said. It's about how do you shift the process and the consciousness so that those people who are often in charge, who do not really understand many of the things that other people live with every single day, have to recognize the importance of bringing voices of color to the table, and leaning into them to get good information that could help direct change. Emphasis for the selection of high-level people in newsrooms or management based off things like how well you can lead versus how well you can perform your job, like a reporter, for example. Allow the voices and concerns of people in the community to inform and drive the kinds of stories we write. Yes, excellent. So that's a perfect example of the first story that I shared with you that I would never have seen in the news, or at least I've not often seen in the news, that my friend Ruth King shared with me, because it helps us understand why people are doing what they're doing rather than just categorizing them as good or bad or right and wrong. Changing metric from clicks and eyeballs to impact on people's lives. Yes. Understanding the results of the decisions that are made and how they play out. Include people's voices and stories where the subject is about things that extend beyond a person's cultural or gender identification. Shifting metrics for success from page views and quantitative reach to impact. And then there's a seconding of Jim here. What else? We've heard primarily from a few people here. Maybe there are things that you want to say that are part of your experience of what you long for being on the receiving end of the news that is put forth, whether it's in print or on television or other resources that you might use, the internet, in order to get information. What about finances? What about transparency around power? What about being able to actually engage in conversations that share information? What about collaboration? I'm putting these out here because I'm not, I'm not in your field. I don't dare think that I know what needs to be done, but I do know from looking at what it means to create equity that some of the things that I just mentioned are really important. How do you feel about that? Or are there other things that you want to add here? We'll take about 5 more minutes to collect some of your ideas. So I'm going to ask another question, because the answers that I'm getting here are about what needs to happen in terms of change on the outside, the policies and practices that actually go on, What kind of changes do you think you need to make on the inside? What kinds of ways and opportunities are there for us to grow our individual and collective consciousness around these patterns that are so deeply ingrained in our society? What would you say you need? I think I'm being heard out there. Am I? Maddie, can you hear me?
Shakti.
Okay. So am I missing any? Because I'm not seeing any response here.
Are you in the stage chat, Shakti? They're responding.
Mm-hmm. I'm not seeing them. Oh, wait, I see. Oh, sorry. I just didn't impact over numbers. Sorry, everybody. I didn't scroll down far enough. Investment, commercial, and foundation and community media, a reconception of journalistic value. I would love to know what that means. Oh, thanks, Denise, for your comment. It's group 3 input. Newsrooms, leadership, and other departments in the media outlet need to reflect the communities they serve. Clearly, that's true. And that means that in a city that is mostly Black and Latinx, the newsroom should reflect that BIPOC people need to be heard, need to be in leadership and management positions so they can share power and decision making. Absolutely. What keeps that from happening? It's racist to continue to deny BIPOC from reporting in management positions when we have a plethora of talented people who are available and willing to step into these positions. So yes, clearly, you know, this is the whole, one of the areas too is how people get hired and what allows them to stay engaged in the work that you're doing. How are they being respected and invited in as part of community? And what allows them to grow in the positions that they're in. Jim is asking Sewell to say more. So Sewell is saying value, less around prizes, prestige, and more around community benefit, meeting readers' information needs. And these are things that are true. My big question would be is if we were working on this, it's what do we need to do to have this happen as a of the change that you would like to see, compensating community members for their expertise. We need to move away from the corporate media, for-profit media model. Journalism for profit does not serve marginalized communities who cannot afford subscriptions to publications and memberships to stations. Is that fair or equitable when you are in the largest, poorest city in the country? Being willing to sacrifice being first sometimes to instead be impactful. So I know that you can all scan this and read this too. I would love to see a few comments. We just have just a couple of minutes if we get some of how you want to change. What do you feel you need to change? Change is an inside job and an outside job, is it not? Mental health resources. Managers need to hear with a less defensive heart. I am going to recommendation tomorrow when I present. I'm going to be sharing a tool that I think is really helpful in terms of deepening the kinds of conversations we can have with one another. Okay, so Cheryl said more empathy and collaborative spirit, knowing that we don't have all of the answers and don't decide what's important. Yes, mental health. I think an elephant in the room is that to make room for more BIPOC leaders in management, a lot of who's in the boardroom needs to leave. Yes, that's true. And what else might be created? How do we refigure and restructure power and how it operates? Yes, Eric, like what you said. So thank Thank you so much for sharing some of your thoughts. I mean, bring these with you. If you participate in Radical Imagination on Thursday, we'll be looking at the internal and the external change that is part of question 2. How might your role as a journalist or media maker also need to shift and or change, which is what I started here at the end, along with what are the roles of journalism that you think need to shift and or change. And if we have the breakout rooms operating in a way, you will come back together again and have a longer period of time to talk to each other and kind of narrow it down to one thing that your group wants to talk about and see if you can actually work it through and make some suggestions about how some of these changes might come to be. More anti-racist training. Concrete action is to create succession plans. Yes, we are in a capitalist country. It's about the money. We need to make journalism an integral part. Sorry, that just ran right by me. An integral part of all of our social justice operation. So I'm going to ask you to bring your attention back. Oh, Cheryl, thank you. Figuring out how to hold myself and others accountable in this work. And how to do that, I think one of the qualities that somebody named was grace. How do we do that with grace? How do we do a both and in so many of the ways that we tend to have a dualistic frame that is so woven deeply into Western epistemology? How do we use the body? We will talk about that more tomorrow. So I want to, can we have the last slide, please, Cheryl? I'm sorry, whoever's changing the slides. It is Cheryl. So part of my longing is to really allow us to do more than say what it is that we think needs to change, but to really focus on what are some of the steps that need to be taken to have that happen. And what happens if you're in a situation where the power is held so tightly that you actually cannot move things forward, or it feels like you can't. Of course, that requires collective action, very much a way that we need to reconsider how we have to work together. In this picture that you're looking at, which is an old-fashioned railroad track, this split in a track is an interesting one to use as a metaphor. I'm using it for the metaphor that relates to fractal change. For those of you who have read the work by Marie Brown, name, we understand that fractal change is a small change. And that if you look at this railroad track as an example of that, you can see that when you change a little bit, you're going to end up in a very different place. And so much of what we're talking about here is being able to understand the value of making small shifts that change the pathway, change the journey that people find themselves on. And that's for us internally, as well as what we do externally. So I want to thank you for being here. I want to close this out with a short story that I think sort of metaphorically embodies what I'm coming at. There is a book that I read a long time ago, and I can't remember the name of it, I'm sorry, but in it is a story about the trials, the trials that took place in South Africa after apartheid. And as you all probably know, people were, and a percentage of people who lived in South Africa who participated in this, both Black and white. It was a time when people could call forth someone who had done great harm in their communities, violence that was meted out upon people. And in the court one day, there was an elderly Black woman who was basically blind, almost completely blind. Not she could see shadow, And it was her turn to speak out. And Mr. Vandervork, who was there, was someone who she had intimately been ingrained in her brain because him kill her husband and her son. And when she came to the stage, but when she came forward to speak, she was asked, what did she want from Mr. Vandervork? She said, well, I want three things. She said, the first thing I want to do is I want to be able to go to where my husband and my son were killed and to gather up some of that dirt so I can take it back to the ghetto where I live and a place for a memorial, a way that I can put that dirt in the ground and be able to visit what represents my husband and my son. That's the first thing that I want. She said, the second thing that I want is that I want to tell Mr. Vandervork that he is truly forgiven. In her Christian faith, and when her husband was dying, he said, forgive them, they know not what they do. Okay. So she said that. And then the third thing that she wanted is she wanted someone to walk her over to Mr. Vandervork. She wanted to put her arms around him to express that she had truly forgiven him, but she also had a request, which is that she wanted him to come once a month to where her husband and her son, where that dirt was put into the ground, so that he could also participate in showing some respect and a position of apology, which is not a word. I can't think of a word that I want to use right now, but to demonstrate his respect for the people whose lives were taken so easily. Mr. Vandervork fainted. He fainted because nowhere in his life had anyone expressed anything like this to him. And so you see, that is on one hand, the power of love. On the other hand, if there hadn't been armed struggle, if there hadn't been radical change, that woman would never have had the opportunity to speak to Mr. Vandervork and come to some kind of healing for herself as well. And so what I'm saying is it's a both and of what we need, how we can move forward, why it's important that we do the internal work of being able to hold that grace where she could afford him, that kind of stance of love, not attached to him as a person, but the force of it. And while at the same time having the practical support that was necessary that allowed her to use her voice. So I want to say thank you to all of you. It is 12:30 for you, and I hope you have a really amazing rest of your day. I want to thank Cheryl and all the people who you were working with who put this together, and to Jim for inviting me to be a part of your incredible convening. And I will see some of you tomorrow. Okay, have a good rest of the day.
Yes, thanks everybody. Thanks for bearing with us. We'll have the breakout rooms fixed in time for the next session. The next session is at 2:30 p.m. It is Momentum, Journalists of Color sharing how the industry can meet this moment. We're going to hear from an amazing panel of journalists, including Sewell Chan, Vanessa Maria Graber, Priya Krishna, Perla Lara, Ernest Owens, and Martin Reynolds. So we hope to see you back at 2:30. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.